Tonight, session 4, we are going to dive into kind of a big conversation. So we've got a lot of slides. That's why it took me a little longer to get everything in there. We're not going to watch a video tonight because session 4 is all about understanding worldviews.
Is that running?
Yes, that's running. I got that running. If anybody wants to peek at it just to make sure the red light's on and the things are actually moving like they should.
Red light's on.
Red light's on.
Yep,
And the
volume button's going up and down.
okay, we're good to go then. All right, let's begin with a word of prayer, and then we'll dive right into the topic for tonight. Father God, we love you. Thank you for tonight. Thank you for the students and those who will watch this on video. God, just bless our conversation. Teach us tonight what it means to understand worldview. And we just love you in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. What is a worldview? Okay. As the word itself suggests, a worldview is the sum total of our beliefs about the world, according to Chuck Colson. It's not a physical view of the world like the sight of the planet Earth you might get from an orbiting space station. Rather, it's a philosophical view of the world, and not just of our planet, but of all reality. Our worldview is an all-encompassing perspective on everything that exists and matters to us. Your worldview represents your most fundamental beliefs and assumptions about the universe you inhabit. It reflects how you would answer all the big questions of human existence, the fundamental questions we ask about life, the universe, and everything. A worldview is the lens of beliefs and presumptions through which you interpret all your experiences and through which you make decisions. Okay? It is that lens. Think of it as kind of a filter through which we view everything that happens in life. All the circumstances, all our relationships, all, turmoils and culture and nations and, everything that happens and swirls around us. We view it through a particular worldview, or at least, everybody does. Is there a God? And if so, what is he like? And how can I know him? If not, does that really matter? What is truth? And can it even be known? Where did the universe come from? And what is its ultimate end? What is the purpose and meaning of life? What makes a life good? And does it matter in the end how I live? What happens after death? Are humans simply advanced animals? Or is there something more to nature? These are all the kind of questions that worldview deals with. How we answer these kinds of questions reveals what our worldview is. It's the lens through which we see and make sense of life and reality. Okay? So, the truth is, Roman numeral 2 here, everyone has a worldview. Even if you're not familiar with it, even if it's unconscious, right? It's unconscious. It's something that's there. You don't even know it's there. It's like me wearing my glasses. I wear my glasses and they help me see, but I don't consciously know they're there. I don't think about them. They're just there, right? The same thing is true for worldview. Everybody has one, even if they couldn't articulate it or they couldn't even tell you what the word means. Everybody has one. Worldviews are like belly buttons. Everyone has one, even if they don't think about it much. In fact, a worldview is more like the air we breathe or the lens of a pair of glasses. You don't usually notice it, but you depend on it every moment to make sense of life. Your worldview shapes how you see and interpret everything, from stories about miracles or life after death, to news about science, ethics, and politics. It influences what you believe, what you question, and how you respond to the world around you. Whether we realize it or not, our worldview guides how we think, how we live, and how we relate to other people. Everyone has one. The only question is whether yours truly reflects reality. I've got a little quote there, but I found this. Worldviews can be compared to eyeglasses. The right choice makes everything come into proper focus. The wrong ones, however, will distort everything that is weird or that is viewed. Okay? So, the reason why are we going to even talk about this in an apologetics class? Why is it even important? When we talk about worldviews, it can sound a bit abstract or even philosophical. But thinking in terms of worldviews is actually one of the most practical skills that an apologetic or a Christian can develop. Every conversation, every news headline, and every moral issue we face is shaped by someone's underlying worldview. So it matters that we know, number one, our worldview, and we're going to get to that, and someone else, where they're coming from. Understanding worldviews helps us see why people think the way they do and why they respond the way they do. It also helps us compare different belief systems, evaluate them with truth in mind, and have more constructive, grace-filled conversations with people who see life differently. So let's look at 4 reasons why it's so valuable to think in terms of worldviews. All right, so A, on your outline, worldviews explain why people see life so differently. Okay, it explains why they see it differently. Why do some people think that the scientific evidence for Darwinism is utterly overwhelming, while others find it wholly unimpressive? Why do some consider abortion to be an abomination, an abominable practice, while others think banning abortion would be a violation of basic human rights? Why do some people view the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks as despicable terrorists, while others praise them as heroes and martyrs? People interpret the same evidence and experiences through very different lenses. What one person sees as proof of God's design, another may call a coincidence or evolution. Our worldview shapes what we consider to be truth. Now, we talked about that last week. It was all about how do we determine truth and different kinds of truth and all of that. But our worldview shapes what we consider to be true and how we define right and wrong. Understanding this helps us move from confusion to clarity when we are engaging others, which is what apologetics is all about. It's how do we engage and have conversation with people with differing views. That's why we're spending a few minutes to talk about worldviews, because we have to know where they're coming from, because that gives us a frame of reference through which to have a conversation. B, worldviews help us compare belief systems. Once we realize that every religion and ideology offers a competing worldview, we can begin to line them up side by side. We can compare how each one answers life's biggest questions about God, humanity, morality, purpose, and see how Christianity provides the most coherent, consistent, and hope-filled answers. So worldviews, helping us make categories, helps us understand and make sense of where someone's coming from. Does that make sense? Okay. C, worldviews help us evaluate truth claims. Just as worldview thinking helps us make meaningful comparisons of different religions and ideologies, exposing their fundamental commonalities and differences, so worldview thinking can help us to make reasoned, principled evaluations of those religions and ideologies. So not all worldviews stand up to scrutiny. Some contradict themselves or fail to explain basic realities, like why morality matters or why anything exists at all. A Christian worldview invites both heart and mind to test truth logically, biblically, and practically, revealing a faith that is not blind, but deeply reasonable. Remember, we talked about that week number 1. We talked about apologetics is about helping people understand that the Christian worldview, right, our Christian beliefs are reasonable. It's not just this crazy, crutch for the mentally ill and people who can't stand up to truth. No, it is completely reasonable when you look at evidence. And so this helps us. Letter D, worldview thinking equips us for fruitful conversations. And this is the heart of why we're even having this discussion. Because the aim of apologetics, remember, the aim of apologetics is to draw people who are outside of the faith toward the gospel, toward Jesus. Well, we have to have fruitful conversations, not arguing debates, fruitful conversations. In order to have a constructive conversation with another person about any topic of importance, you need to have a good understanding of their basic outlook on life and what ultimately motivates their beliefs and responses. For the same reason, it's best if the other person has a good grasp of your basic outlook on life and what ultimately motivates your beliefs and responses. That's the apologetics part. We have to understand what we believe. We have to understand what someone else believes so that we can have a conversation with commonality that then we take them to the truth, right, and who Jesus is. Furthermore, to have a really fruitful discussion, you need a clear view of the most central and fundamental points of agreement and disagreement between the two of you, and some notion of how to evaluate your differences in a principled way. When we enter into conversations with unbelievers over controversial topics, we should recognize that any significant disagreements we encounter will often trace back to more fundamental worldview differences. And we're going to get to that. When that's the case, the most responsible and constructive way forward will not be to try to ignore or bypass those foundational differences, but rather to acknowledge them and lay them out on the table for scrutiny. Okay? For instance, if you're having a deep conversation or a religious conversation with a Muslim, okay, it won't do you any good. It won't be constructive for you to start with cosmology, in the beginning of the universe, and trying to convince them that God exists. They already believe God exists. So your conversation has to go to where you diverge. The both of you, and we're going to look at this a little bit, both of you, the Muslim and the Christian, both have a theistic worldview, but they diverge at a certain point. So you have to find the commonality. We both believe in God, but now we have to find the divergent point, who is Jesus, which is what matters, right? That's why it matters to know who your host is, to know who you're talking to, what their worldview is, versus you're having a deep conversation with an atheist who is, a science geek and, absolutely believes in evolution, Darwinism, the whole deal. Okay, you can't talk to them the same way you would a theist. You have to talk to them like an atheist. And you've got to find commonality and universe kind of stuff and all of that, right? So it helps to know where they're coming from and be familiar with that, okay? When we're trained to think in terms of worldviews, we're better equipped to challenge unbelievers at the root of their beliefs and actions rather than at the surface level. We're able to expose the crumbling foundations of their houses rather than just the creaky floorboards, okay? This approach helps us engage unbelievers with gentleness and respect, exposing weak foundations and pointing them toward the truth of the gospel, graciously and thoughtfully. All right? Any questions about that? Pretty straightforward, but this is why it's important to understand worldview. When you begin to understand and see things in those categories, and in other words, when we study this, hopefully what you'll begin to notice is that when you hear someone say something, you'll be able to go, okay, they said that, and that can trace back to this worldview and where they're at with that. Okay, so if I'm going to have a conversation with them, I'm going to talk to them in this category and what that means and all that kind of thing. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's talk about the three main categories of worldviews. When I was researching for this, there were a lot. There were a lot of different categories, a lot of different approaches, a lot of different ways in which people talked about the different categories of worldviews. The one I liked, I've grabbed and I'm going to give it to you now, basically separates all worldviews into three categories. And the way it's chosen is it starts with each of these worldviews and all the ones that flow from them. What do they think about God? Okay, there's three main that they view God in a certain way, and I thought that was a great way to approach it because everybody starts there and then it goes from there. Okay, so when we look at human thought across cultures and history, most worldviews can be grouped into three broad categories. These categories help us understand how people make sense of reality, life, and purpose. People interpret the world in different ways, but most worldviews fall into these categories. A starts with theism. Theism says that God is personal and distinct. All right? Now, theism, okay, is at the top, right? Theism, and from theism you would have Christian theism, Islamic theism, as well as Judeo-theism, right? The three major religions of the world are all theistic. They all believe in God, that God sits at the top. But Christianity diverges from Judaism and certainly from Islam in a lot of different ways. But they all start with a belief that God is personal and distinct. Okay? So any major worldview religion you can think of falls under these categories and subcategories as you go. But it all starts with theism. Theistic worldviews affirm the existence of a personal, intelligent God who is distinct from the universe but interacts with it. God has purposes and desires, and humans have the ability to know and relate to him. This worldview sees the universe as created intentionally with meaning and moral order built in. Examples, as I've already given to you, Christianity, Islam, Judaism. In theism, life has ultimate purpose and significance because it is grounded in God. All right? Now, number two, or letter B. Letter B is naturalism, or another way of putting this is materialism. Okay? Naturalism or materialism. And this says there is no God. So everything that falls under naturalism and materialism, and there's a bunch, Darwinism, and we'll give you scientism and humanism, and all of these, they start with the premise that says there is no God. There's no supernatural. There's only what you can see, yada, yada, yada. Naturalistic or materialistic worldviews deny the existence of a personal God. They view the universe as fully material, operating according to natural laws without divine intervention. Humans are products of evolution and chance, and meaning must be created by human beings themselves. Ethics, knowledge, and purpose are understood in human-centered or scientific terms. Examples include atheism, secular humanism, Marxism. Life under naturalism is often understood as temporary and finite, with meaning derived from relationships, accomplishments, or societal contributions. Okay? So that's naturalism or materialism. Okay? The third main category is what we're calling pantheism or monism. Okay? This is kind of, think of it as almost a combination of the two, where there is a God, but God is the world. God is the universe. God is in everything and around everything. Okay? They identify God with the universe itself. The divine is not a personal being, but the ultimate reality, which is present in all things. Humans are part of this large whole, and the focus is often on achieving harmony, enlightenment, or unity with the cosmos. Examples include Hinduism, Buddhism, and some New Age philosophies. In this worldview, morality and purpose often come from aligning oneself with the universe rather than following a separate personal God. Okay? These three categories help us understand the big picture of how people see the world and make sense of life. Knowing these categories is the first step to seeing how worldviews shape the answers people give to life's most important questions about God, humanity, purpose, and how we should live. Okay? Questions about the three categories. Like I said, all the research I've been doing, all the stuff I've been reading, all these apologists who write books, they all kind of categorize things a little different and come at it from, different angles and things like that. But it basically comes down to this. I like this one only because I thought a good starting point was, okay, how do they view God? And then we go from there. There is no God. There is a God. He's personal and knowable. And, God is the universe and he's all around us and all that kind of thing. Okay? So, now, in knowing the three main categories, now I want to talk about the parts of a worldview. These are the individual parts that make up the whole, what it's made of. Okay? Every worldview, whether religious or secular, is like a recipe made up of certain key ingredients. These ingredients shape how we see reality, define what's true, and decide how to live. Okay? So, here are the main parts of all the worldviews. Okay? The first is God, or theology. Every worldview has a theology. It says something about God or the divine. The view may be very precise or vague, explicit or implicit, negative or positive, i.e., atheistic versus theistic, but every worldview talks about God. Okay? Even if it's to the extent where they say there is none, right? That's still talking about it. They address the God issue. Some key questions that we might ask of a worldview under this heading would be, is there a God? Which is the most important question of all. What is God like? Is God a perfect being? Is God a personal being? How does God relate to the world? According to some worldviews, God is transcendent and distinct from the world. According to others, God is identical to the world, and still others take a position somewhere in between. How does God relate to human beings in general? Can he be known? Has he revealed himself? You might think that atheistic worldviews cannot have a theology because they deny there's a God in the first place, but even atheistic worldviews have something to say about God, even if it's only to say he doesn't exist. Even atheistic worldviews then have a kind of theology, albeit a negative one. In fact, we can go further and observe that every worldview has its own quote-unquote God, in the sense that it posits some kind of ultimate reality. For the scientists, it's about physical particles. And there's, God is what can be known in science and all that kind of thing, right? So that's theology. What a worldview affirms about ultimate reality and ultimate authority functions as its a theology. So when we go back and we talk about theology, this really boils down to how a particular worldview affirms the ultimate reality and ultimate authority. Okay? For Christians, our God equation we answer to God. He's the authority. We answer to him, right? A scientist would say, no, we answer to the laws of physics and the laws of nature and, the universe itself and these kind of things. And there's no higher being and all that. Okay? All right. Letter B, knowledge, also known as epistemology. It's the study of knowing, what can be known, what's knowable, these kind of things. Knowledge is widely viewed as a very useful and important thing. Knowledge is certainly more valuable than mere opinion. If I were to tell you that eating a whole raw cabbage every day would add a decade to your life, it would matter to you whether I really knew that to be true. Right? Likewise, worldviews usually attempt to explain knowledge, what we can know and how we can know it. It also comments on closely related subjects like truth, logic, reason, experience, intuition, and revelation. Some key questions we might ask of a worldview under this heading would be, can we know anything at all? What can we know about God? What can we know about the universe? What can we know about ourselves? What's the best kind of knowledge to have? All these kind of things, okay? That's all about knowledge. What's knowable? How can we know? And I'm not going to get into the philosophical stuff about, all that kind of stuff, but that's part of it. C, which be origins or cosmology. Worldviews always explicitly or implicitly tell us where we came from. For instance, the secular worldviews rely on some form of molecules to man evolution. Biblical Christianity teaches special creation in 6 days a few thousand years ago. So there's a difference in how our worldview answers the question of origins. D, humanity or anthropology. In the same way, every worldview has a take on human beings. It represents a certain perspective on humanity. It articulates our origin, our uniqueness or non-uniqueness, our purpose, nature, and destiny. Worldviews always address what we are and our significance. Some key questions we might ask about this would be, what are human beings? What kind of beings are we? Are we creatures made in the image of God? Are we gods in embryo? Are we the unintended products of naturalistic evolution? Something else altogether, right? Where do we come from? Note this is closely related to the first question we had. Are we special or unique? Do we exist in any particular reason or purpose? Things like when we talk about in Christian worldview that we were made in the image of God, that puts humanity in a particular place in creation. We are over the animals versus Darwinism that says, no, we're just a higher evolved form of animal, right? And so when we begin to look at things in the real world, like murder or, clearing out forests to make room for neighborhoods and things like that, and I'm cutting down a bunch of trees, well, if I believe in Darwinianism and I believe in secular humanism, what right do humans have to kill all that other life to make room for your life? These kind of things. So, humanity, it's talked about. E would be morality. Each worldview also has a distinct take on goodness and morality. Ethics covers areas like the highest good, whether morality is objective or subjective, what is right and what is wrong, and the rewards for doing good or judgments for doing evil. To borrow from the title of the book by Francis Schaeffer, every worldview has something to say in answer to the question, how should we then live? Some key questions. What is the highest or ultimate good? Is it God, love, knowledge, pleasure, power? Is morality real or merely illusory? Are some things really right or some things really wrong? Is morality objective or is it subjective? Are there any moral absolutes? If morality is always relative, what is it relative to? Is it relative to the individual or to the community or to the species? So on and so forth. You get the idea. Each worldview addresses morality to some degree. Okay? Stop me if you have a question. All right. Letter F. salvation. Every worldview talks about a salvation story. When Christians hear the word salvation, we tend to think of salvation from sin, death, and hell through the atoning work of Jesus. But here, in this context, salvation is more generic. What is the basic human problem, and what is the solution to that problem? Here's how this matters. Again, so when you see salvation, in our worldview, salvation means something based on our understanding of God, our understanding of man, our understanding of death. See, they all weave together, right? But in the grand scheme, other worldviews talk about salvation, but in a different way. They don't mean the same thing we say, right? Everyone thinks, and it comes down to this, everyone thinks that there's something wrong with the world. Everybody would agree with that, regardless of Christian, not Christian, whatever. It doesn't, you just look at the world and you can figure out it's not right. Something's wrong. Do you know anyone who thinks the world is just right in every way? Right? Even those who deny in theory the reality of good and evil find it hard, if not impossible, to apply their theory consistently in practice. For example, they'll often want to say that we will be better off once we recognize the non-reality of good and evil, but that seems to presuppose our current situation isn't as good as it could be. Everyone thinks our lives could be better in certain ways than they are now. And when pressed, they will tend to generalize or boil things down to one general problem. Here's some key questions. What is humanity's most basic problem? You see, again, when you think about these worldviews, for us, we answer the problem of humanity with understanding sin. That sin entered the world, and because of sin, man has fallen. And because man is fallen, it's not the way it's supposed to be, right? That's how we would answer it for Christianity. But someone who's a naturalist, someone who says, there is no God, they would say, well, the problem with humanity is in our culture, or the problem is in our society, or the problem is in, whatever. They put the blame somewhere else. Okay? Yeah, things like that. So what is humanity's most basic problem? What, if anything, is the solution? See, each worldview tries to come up with their own solution. What's the solution? What are the prospects for the problem being solved? Will it ever be solved, or is it all just going to hell in a handbasket? Who, if anyone, can help solve the problem, and how? All right, these are questions that all worldviews have to ask. All right, G, meaning, teleology. What is the meaning of life? Every worldview aims to answer this question. The answer to this question in each worldview tells us why we are even here. It's one of the basic questions of life. What is the meaning in life? Again, Christians can give a solid answer for that question. But how does a Scientology guy, or I mean not Scientology, but a Marxist or a Darwinism guy, how do they answer this question? Is there meaning in life? When you believe that everything is just evolving and going from one to the next and we're just all the same, what is the purpose? What is the meaning, right? And they have a hard time with that, and so do the others, okay? Good. H, destiny. Destiny. Or eschatology. Now again, when we in Christian theology say eschatology, we're talking about what the Bible talks about, end times, right? And what does the Bible say is going to happen at the end? But for other worldviews, the study of the end or study of destiny doesn't involve what the Bible says. It's just, what do they see coming in the future? So a worldview tells us something about the destiny of the universe and everyone in it. Though the end has not happened yet, each worldview describes what will happen based on their understanding of reality and revelation. We're going to look at some examples of this. So destiny is part of every worldview. Okay, are we all, Is it all just going in the ground? It's all just going to become annihilated one day? Or is there something more or whatever? And the last point I've got, letter I on here, is that it's all 8 of these points are interrelated. It's important to see that these 8 areas are closely interrelated. What a person believes in one area will inevitably affect what they believe in other areas. What you believe about God has implications of your view of human beings, our nature, origins, purpose, and destiny. What you believe about God and human beings will in turn influence your views on what we can know, how we should live, what our basic problem is, and how that problem can and should be solved. All right? So, turn in your outline now to this chart I made for you. It's a worldview comparison chart. And in here, in this chart, I gave you some basic understanding of what each of these worldviews, each of these columns, how they would answer some of these questions, okay? And so I just kind of wanted to go through, and if you have any questions or whatever, or comments or thoughts, please let me know. So, worldview, here are the 8 on the side, on the left-hand side, followed by the 3 columns, which are the 3 worldviews. So, theism. What would theism say about God? Theism would say, well, God is. He's personal and transcendent. Someone in the naturalism worldview would say, no, there's no God. Reality is what we see. Reality is matter. Everything we can see and touch and feel. There's no other immaterial universe. It's just what we can see. Okay? Or a pantheism or a monism person would say, well, God is the universe and he's impersonal, but he's everywhere and he's in all of us and, that kind of thing. Knowledge, for another example, for a Christian or for a theist, knowledge is truth that comes from God plus reason. So it's not just revelation, it's reason too. A naturalism material person would say, no, knowledge comes from science and observation and reason. Where pantheists would say, well, it's all about intuition and mystical insight, and we're enlightened, and when we, burn this certain incense and we can feel all the, and the crystals and the this and the that and the auras and the, all that kind of stuff. It's all about feeling and all of that. All right? And you could go on down the line. So a theist would say our origins were, creation, God created. No, naturalists would say universe arose naturally. And the pantheist would say, no, the universe is divine, it's eternal, it's always been, and all this kind of stuff. There's cycles and things. And you could just kind of go down the line. Does any of these things kind of pop out at you? Morality. Answer this question. So go to morality. Why would a naturalism or a materialistic guy, a no-God person, why would they say morality is relative or emergent? Why would they give that answer? Why would they say that about morality?
I think because they would see it as not being true in all circumstances.
Okay.
So depending upon what is going on and even who is involved, something could be right or not right.
Right. And the reason is you and I understand intrinsically where morality comes from, right? Morality comes from God. It comes from His Word. It comes from our conscience. It comes in how we were created in His image. We know when something is right or wrong morally. And the laws help us fine-tune some of that, but we know. But if you don't believe in God, if God doesn't exist. There's no supernatural guide, and we're all just evolved, higher forms of animal. Look, wolves have no understanding of morality. They don't. They care for the pack, sure, but they'll turn on one of their own. The weakest one will get devoured. Things you and I would look at and go, oh, that's terrible. But an animal doesn't think about that. Why? Because in our worldview, our morality comes from God. We're created in His image. The animals were not created in His image. Therefore, they do not understand morality. We do. But a naturalist would go, that doesn't make any sense. We just have morality because we're smarter. They would say our higher evolved brain created morality in our culture to protect ourselves and has nothing to do with a higher being. But then if that's true and our morality comes from whatever's good for the community or the culture or whatever, then it's very relative. Maybe it's better for the community that that person die or that person be euthanized or that person be, you know what I mean? And so everything is relative. See how that comes about? Let's see. What else? Anything else kind of pop out at you?
These are not all exact silos. There is some movement that goes on.
Yeah. Yeah, these are just basic.
But they're good silos to see significant differences.
Yeah, and to keep in mind, I gave you 3 columns. Those are 3 broad categories that within those broad categories, you've got a lot of divergence, and so in understanding some of that, but in a narrow way, in just understanding where somebody comes from, when you hear a statement, like for instance, a modern day statement about abortion, okay? When someone tries to defend abortion and say, well, that woman should have the right to, whatever she wants to do with her body, her decision, that kind of thing. That argument and that stance, what does that do? Why? Where's that coming from? Okay? It's coming from an absolute disconnect and a dismissal of the secondary life that is in her. Okay? They see that, they don't even want to call it a baby, they call it a fetus, and they want to try to declare that it's not viable until it's born. But science and everything else has proven that that child responds from a very, very young age. I can't remember how many weeks. Responds to pain stimulus, responds to music and other things like that. But they want to dismiss the humanity of that life. Well, again, when you fall into that naturalism category and you're denying that human being has any rights or life, it kind of fits. Now, that's not to say that everybody who's pro-abortion is a naturalist, because there are Christians who fall into that category, unfortunately. But this is the tricky part, right? So we're talking about worldviews. And this is why it's going to be important for you to formulate your particular worldview, because some Christians are guilty of accepting the Christian worldview mostly, but then they are uncomfortable with certain parts of it, so then they want to come over here and dance with the naturalists or even the pantheists because they're uncomfortable with some of the hard truth found in the scriptures, right? And we can't do that. We can't be inconsistent with our biblical worldview. It's either true or it's not. And if it's true, you've got to follow it. Now, there can be some disagreements on interpretation and things like that. I get that. But there are some Christians who really, they just set aside what's clearly true because they're uncomfortable and they want to go with culture and that's not a good sign. So down at the bottom, I gave you some versions, kind of, scientism, secular humanism, atheism in the middle there, Hinduism. You see on the far right, that's a lot of Eastern Orthodox kind of religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, very prevalent over in Asia. That's kind of some of where you see some of that New Age. You see I snuck in there Star Wars. You see that? I put that in there. You saw that? And the reason I put Star Wars in there was because that whole idea of the Force, may the Force be with you. There are some people that are in this column who would say, oh yes, that's exactly what God is. God is this force, and you have to tap into it, and it's, all this yin and yang and all this kind of thing. So I snuck it in there. I wanted to see if anybody was paying attention and saw that. Any questions about this chart? We'll reference it. Again, we'll come back to it at different times. But now I want to give you your homework. Here's your homework for this week. Okay? And don't let it overwhelm you. Don't let this overwhelm you. Let me walk you through this homework, because you're going to start the process of putting together your biblical worldview. Okay? So, here are the instructions. Reflect on each section, that's these 8 sections, and write a short paragraph, 2 to 5 sentences. So I'm not looking for a lot of detail, just a short sentence or two, answering each question in your own words. Make it simple yet accurate. Support your answers with at least one scripture reference for each worldview element. And then pray as you work. Ask God to help you see the truth. So, number 1 is about God, or theology. Who is God? What does the Bible teach about who God is, what He's like? What is God both personal and powerful? How does knowing God as Creator and Father shape how you see the world? So here's what I want you to do. I want you to think about what you believe to be true based on the Scripture about who God is. Okay, now you don't have to get super theology, and you can go back to the theology notes from last year, but you don't have to get super technical. Some key passages to look at, but here's an example. Here's an example. I gave that to you because I wanted you to see kind of where, there is one personal sovereign God who created and sustains all things. That's a simple statement about what you believe about God, what you believe the Bible teaches us about God. Okay? So that's kind of what I want you to do for each of these 8 areas. Origins, where did everything come from? Answer these questions, read these Bible verses, and then write out, the universe was created by God's word in an instant for humanity, or whatever. Okay? Humanity, who are we? What makes human beings unique compared to the rest of creation? You can talk about image of God, but just, again, little. I'm not talking big, long paragraphs, but be accurate, but be simple, all right? Because what we're going to do is this week, this is what you're going to do. You're going to come and give it to the class next week. And then the following week, we're going to put it all together into a final phrase or paragraph that defines what you would believe to be true about your biblical worldview, okay? And I want us to make it simple enough because I want you to be able to memorize it and be able to tell it to somebody, to say it to somebody. I believe da 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 da, and here's why. Okay? That's my goal, for you to really get a grasp of some of the big questions and how to answer them according to the Scriptures. Does that make sense? So that's what this exercise is. So don't get wigged out about it. Just kind of go through, write your sentences, and we'll talk about it next week. Okay? I put this last little thing in here just as a little addendum for you to have some extra reading if you want to go read what this guy, Del Tackett, says. I thought this was pretty good. Some different additional information. Okay? All right. We got through it.